Final review. Hopefully you guys are feeling fine 2 days away from the AP test. I love seeing how, even though there's no de jure gender segregation in the classroom, we have de facto gender segregation with Dude Town and Ladyville. And so it's nice that we've got clear delineations going on. So, good job, guys. And so, before, what?
It was like not like that at the beginning.
Yeah.
And eventually.
The dudes just cower. Just
Yeah.
yeah. Herd mentality. Pierce is kind of in that in between neighborhood. Yes. So before we get started today, I plan on throwing at you a ton of review questions tonight to give you guys a chance to get your content straight. You can choose whether you want this to be competitive or not competitive. So if we want to be competitive. All right. So anyway, we've got an argument for. But first of all, I'm willing to reteach any concepts that you guys need to have retaught 2 days out to make sure that you're safe. So are there any things from U.S. history, from concept outlines or whatever, that you need to have clarified or fixed before we take our test?
How did the ideas during World War II influence reform, like civil rights?
So how did the ideas of World War II?
That was like an FRQ I tried doing last hour and it did not work.
Okay. So if we take that as our FRQ, it's a causation question of how did elements of World War II then lead to the Civil War movement, civil rights movement that emerges after World War II is done. So let's peel it apart first of all. When we think about World War II, what is happening in the situation with African Americans that's causing them to re-evaluate their situation?
Segregation.
You do have segregation. And what is the battle cry for African Americans during the war? You've got a double V for victory, where African Americans want to fight for victory overseas and then fight for victory over here in America. And one of the dilemmas that we're facing in World War II is we're fighting against what governmental system in Germany that we really hate? Fascism. It's really hard to be a good democratic country that is putting down fascism or later communism if you're engaging in an apartheid sort of segregation system. And so we're going to find that just that alone is going to lead to a rethinking, but then also you have A. Philip Randolph during World War II threatening to march on Washington if something's not done to create fair labor practices inside the workplace and desegregation there. We're going to find that for the war effort, a lot of soldiers will come back home with an experience that wasn't good with segregation, so you're going to see Truman desegregate the military because of their experiences during World War II. And it's very much that is going to start the momentum rolling, where by being the president for African Americans with Roosevelt, in order to hold that coalition together, you can't tolerate segregation. So that's what you see in 1948 with Truman, desegregating the military, Jackie Robinson in baseball, and he's doing it so much that he's got the Dixiecrats mad at him. So I could see those things, but then also economically, what's the movement of African Americans from South to North Hall? You have another one of those where you have large numbers of African Americans moving to inner cities, and that gives them the concentration that they need to be able to form civil rights movements. And then what new communication technology comes right after World War II? There you go. I can see all that stuff leading into that question. Okay. Go ahead.
The military was the first thing to be segregated?
Yes. Although you could argue that with the Fair Employment Practices laws that were created during Roosevelt's time, that you've got war industries that were supposed to desegregate. The enthusiasm for that was mixed, though, but at least Roosevelt made an effort. Go ahead.
What's the XYZ affair?
XYZ affair is during Adams' presidency, and it's happening because after the Jay Treaty with Britain, France is confused about what we're up to. They helped us win the revolution. We didn't give them anything, and we haven't been paying back their debts. So now, just a decade after do that are known as X, Y, and Z. And as a result, Americans are going to be insulted, especially Adams, and he's going to treat that as a threat of war. And so that creates what's known as the quasi-war period, where we're building up our military. You got the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then thankfully we didn't have a war. He was able to call that off before his end of his presidency. Any other things you need to have re-taught, re-explained, or whatever, Kirby? Funding at par. It's part of Hamilton's big plan where he wants to gather all the debts of the United States together, get assumption, and then what he feels is if America gets the reputation that we only pay back like pennies on the dollar when we borrow money, nobody would be stupid enough to ever lend us money in the future. So very much Hamilton's behavior back then is why some people aren't really worried about our debt issues nowadays, because everybody's willing to lend us money now because that's the standard, is that we will always pay our money back. So we've got people falling over themselves willing to give us loans, which means we can kind of maintain our status quo for a while, even though it could get really dangerous eventually.
How did that, like, there's something about like farmers and they have like debts, rich people come down towards that?
Yeah. So Hamilton's plan of funding at par and assumption was the idea that you're going to take all these debts from the colonies. Some of them owe a lot, some of them owe a little, some of them owe none, but you're going to gather that all together into one United States debt. You're going to put it inside of a bus that will eventually be paying it back. It gives Hamilton then the excuse to charge everybody taxes, which is where your whiskey rebellion is coming from. But when Hamilton decides that he is going to fund the debt at par, the bus is a private and public institution. It's part owned by the government, but it's part owned by bankers, and they are deep into understanding what Hamilton is up to. So they find out early that he's going to fund at par. Meanwhile, you've got these farmers who are in the back country who are unhappy because like a decade earlier, they lent money to the federal government to fight the war. And you've got these bankers who are going to work their way out in the back country, and they're going to tell these guys, you're never going to get paid back. And so they're going to offer them pennies on the dollar for their debts, knowing full well that Hamilton's going to pay them back face value for their debts. And so these guys are scamming these guys. They're speculators. They're speculating that by buying up this debt, it's going to become rich eventually. And while they're not technically doing anything illegal, this is pretty much insider trading. It's unethical. And so what they're doing here should be wrong. And Jefferson is going to be hopping mad to try to protect these guys because these guys are farmers. These guys are fat cat bankers, but that's who Hamilton really digs, is he feels like those guys are the important people in society. Do you have anything else you need to have retaught at this point, or re-explained, or whatever, to make sure you're safe?
This might be like a broad question.
Yes.
But like during like the age where like all of them was in reading, like what was like the economy like? Like what were they like? What was like? That's what I'm like, because like I know like yeah. Because like I know like right after like industrialization, so that's like where are we at then?
So when we think about Seneca Falls in the 1840s, you're going to have a country that is in the middle of an industrial revolution and a market revolution, with Lowell Mills textile factories in the north, steamboats, and a movement towards urbanization, but still the majority of Americans are working on farms. Your second Great Awakening is sending preachers out to the back country and rural back areas, where they're creating these gigantic religious festivals that are inspiring people to get involved in reform. And those ideas are working their way into the cities, where a lot of women have extra time because they're part of now the cult of domesticity. So middle and upper income white women are expected to take care of the home, not go to work. And as a result, they finish their work really early, and they start meeting with other women. They start forming other sorts of voluntary societies, and many of them start thinking, why is it they can't get involved in the stuff that's happening to make reform happen, especially suffrage and abolition. We do have crashes around this time. We have a panic in 1837 and 1857. But remember, economic crashes impact different groups differently. So for middle to upper income white women, they're typically the ones who, when a crash comes, they're going to be the ones who float over the top of it. Some of them will be pulled down, but a lot of them are just going to be fine because they've got family connections, money, and so a lot of them are able to dedicate themselves to reform and be able to focus on that issue, especially now that they see a connection between typically the questions about economics during that time period are what caused the rise of the market revolution, what caused the Gilded Age, and I haven't seen tons about economic crashes in the mid 1800s, but you will get questions about the populace, which is very much about the panics of 1873 and 93, and the issues that the farmers were running into.
Yeah, I was just like how that.
They would weave that all into a market revolution essay question to talk about how that, and typically it'll either be market revolution, urbanization, industrialization, transportation revolution. So one of those could be the topic, and then all of them could be part of that essay. Okay? Really glad you asked that question. Go ahead. So first Great Awakening is largely puritanical, where you've got up in the northeastern part of the United States, in the early 1700s, you have these preachers who start fanning out from those early puritanical colleges who are nervous about what's been happening to religion inside their area because they feel like it's getting too soft. And so they fan out, and they've got these fire and brimstone speeches they're delivering, like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, talking about how you're sinners in the hands of an angry God, where you're like a spider that God wants to throw into the bonfire. And when they come through, they have a really weird impact because they're challenging the church they normally attend. And their message is meant to be like really fire and brimstone, but a lot of people are getting this democratic message that I don't need to listen to my preacher, I want to listen to this person. So it's adding an element of choice to Puritanism, where in the past Puritans have been, you do exactly what's told to you or else you're not on God's list, you're not predestined to heaven. And so now you end up with churches that are divided into old lights and new lights, and the churches end up splitting. And it's one of many splits that you're going to have. So this is the reason why when you drive around, you don't see a Puritan church of Plymouth. You'll find groups like Episcopalians and Baptists and Methodists and other sorts of splinters that came out of the First Great Awakening. And then the Second Great Awakening is the one in the 1830s, where you have preachers traveling around again, and they're trying to reinvigorate people's religious lives. But their message in the North is being taken with an element that you should also reform your society that you're in. And that leads to all those reform movements of abolitionism, women's suffrage, temperance reform, prison reform, all that sort of stuff. Do you have any other questions? Go ahead.
What was the habeas corpus?
Habeas corpus is right to a speedy trial and to find out what you've been charged with. And so when we think about Abraham Lincoln's presidency, he gets elected in 1860. And while we're in that lame duck period until March of 1861, James Buchanan is allowing the country to disintegrate. And especially, you've got a couple slave states, Maryland being the most important of them, which is to the north of Washington, D.C. And the problem is, Lincoln has to get through slave territory in order to get to D.C., and people are threatening his life. So when he gets into Washington, D.C., and the country starts seceding, he's got a problem because he's surrounded by these slave territories. And so what he's going to do at the beginning of the Civil War is he's going to impose martial law in certain places, especially in Maryland. He's going to tell people you can't be out at certain times of night. You've got a curfew. There are certain areas you can't go because we don't want you blowing up train tracks or cutting down telegraph lines. And then he's going to suspend the right of habeas corpus, which means if we suspect that you are a Confederate who's working for them, we're not going to give you a speedy trial and get you back on the street. We're not going to free you quickly. We're going to treat you more like a prisoner of war for a period of time in very select areas of the North that they're trying to keep from turning to the South. Go ahead.
What were the main ideas of the populists?
Absolutely. The populists in the late 1800s came from the Grange and the Alliance movements that farmers were into. And so their big things are they hate monopolies, especially railroads. They want much more direct democracy. They like the idea of direct election of senators and figuring out ways to get corruption out of the government. They want to figure out ways for the government to do things to help prop up farm prices. In particular, they most want silver. They would like to add silver to the money supply to inflate the money, and that will then increase prices, and that will hopefully, during the panic of 1893, help them to not go bankrupt, because they're trying to figure out easier ways to pay their loans during a period of deflation where the prices keep dropping, but their loan payment stays the same, and the banks aren't willing to do anything to help them. Anything else you guys need help with before I get rolling or review today?
During the Gilded Age, what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans?
Great question. Typically not a whole lot. And when we we think about what's going on with them, oftentimes they represent different regions. And so oftentimes that affects the use of the spoil system, where the spoil system will oftentimes be rewarding people from different areas, like Democrats will reward Southerners and inner city politicians, Republicans more rural sorts of areas. And then what you'll also find is inside the Republican Party, there's a split that happens after Garfield's assassination called the stalwarts and half-breeds and the mugwumps, where they're not agreeing over what reform looks like. And so they're going to get reform like the Pendleton Act during Arthur's presidency to rein in the spoil system. But there's going to be some people who believe that that's not enough, and that's why they vote for Grover Cleveland, thinking that he's going to be a reformer, and instead he's not much of one. He ends up vetoing a lot of stuff the Republicans do, but otherwise he's not really much that different from the Republicans. And so that's why you end up with the populists, where they run William James Bryan as a radical, with the feeling that Democrats and Republicans are pretty much identical to one another, and none of them care about farmers or poor people. The other thing to think about is oftentimes the Democratic Party had more influence over political machines because they were more attractive to immigrants who were coming in, and they were more receptive to them.
Is the Gilded Age more of a political or a social era, or is it both?
I include economic with that as well. And so for the Gilded Age, in Mark Twain's estimation, he's just coming up with that nickname because it looks shiny on the outside, but it's really corrupt and dark on the inside. And so he's talking about it politically with all the political corruption that's going on, socially, where if you look at the rich and elite, they look great, but if you go just behind the scenes to any of the inner city areas, people are living a really rough life. And that's very much playing out economically too, where you've got this boom of economic prosperity for the rich, and you've got middle class doing okay, and for the poor, they're not dying because of deflation. With deflation, they can just be stuck with really bad wages, but the price of everything keeps dropping, so their real wages don't seem too bad until you crash every 10 years, and then that bottom end ends up getting clobbered, losing all their life savings, and then they start off from zero all over again. So it's all those things.
Is there like a start and end date to the Gilded Age?
Good question. I would say that whenever I'm asked about the Gilded Age, whether teaching or writing or whatever, I always started with the Civil War, where the beginning part is really murky, but it's all of those things that Lincoln's up to, where like the greenbacks and the boom of like the factories and the rebuilding of the railroads and the encouragement of expansion out west. He sets all the stages for an industrial boom. And he's very much building that off of the ideas of Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton, the idea that the government can do things to stimulate the growth of business. But then you find after his time, you end up with like the Grants, who are very much a corrupt group of presidents who are willing to engage in corruption and spoil system or whatever. And that then accelerates it. Go ahead.
Was it the Wizard of Oz that was based off the Gilded Age?
It was definitely it's seen as an allegory for the populace, although the author claimed that there was nothing there. He was also saying that during a time with like Red Scares and whatever, where being a radical is not necessarily the greatest thing to announce. So, any other questions? Go ahead.
Can you explain like inflation and deflation stuff?
Absolutely. So, inflation is just some set of conditions that's causing all of our prices to rise. It could happen for a bunch of different reasons. One sort of inflation could be currency-driven inflation. So if all of a sudden we start printing more dollar bills, kind of like Germany did after World War I to pay their reparations, you will then see inflation take place. Because with more dollar bills floating around, each of them are worth less. And so as a result, it's going to take more of them to buy stuff. You can also have an inflation rate that's caused by a commodity becoming more scarce, like you saw in the 1970s when oil became more scarce during our oil shutdowns. That then caused inflation, because if it's harder to get a tank of gas and it's more expensive, it's going to make everything else more expensive that requires a tank of gas. So what we're going to see during the 1970s is an inflationary period, because the government has been cranking out tons of money, borrowing on debt, gas prices go up, so you have a perfect storm of all these prices going up. Deflation, on the other hand, is something where prices all keep dropping. And this can happen either because we cut the amount of money that's floating around. So imagine like the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. When we got rid of that and now we're not using silver as money, suddenly every dollar bill is now more scarce. It's now more valuable, and so prices will drop because it takes less dollars to buy stuff. So that's where the way you get deflation is each dollar becomes more valuable as a result. And then when you look at stagflation in the 1970s, it's just the combination that the economy slows down at precisely the same time that prices shoot up. And our problem is that all of our old solutions from the New Deal don't work with that situation. You can't start spending on government programs unless you're really willing to risk hyperinflation where the prices will just shoot through the roof because of all the dollars you're adding to the system. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Why does it matter so much if prices increase or decrease a lot if wages are going at the same time? Like if it's like $500 for a loaf of bread, but you're making that much more money, then like why is it such a big deal?
Wages are sticky, prices
But,
are
like,
fluid.
Yeah, but like if the wages also went up, then like
Wouldn't that be nice?
But no, like because the wages aren't sticky, then
Yes.
then what's sticky? That's what I mean.
Do you have a time when wages have not been sticky?
It's a hypothetical question.
Okay, so let's deal hypothetically. It would be magical if when prices moved, that wages also went along with them. But as you've seen throughout U.S. history, you're going to see it in world history next year as well. Why does somebody start a business? To make money. So if there's a way that as a business owner you can increase prices and not raise people's wages, all of that extra money would then be your profit. And you found throughout history that oftentimes to get those wage increases, it usually hasn't been a gift from the business owner. It's usually some form of leverage that is used. Now, either it's because you got like really good skills where you quit that job and find a new one and so they have to pay you, or else unions have stepped in and struck and whatever to force wages, or you've had minimum wage laws. But if you don't have any of those things, then typically business owners will stubbornly try to figure out ways to not increase pay because if they don't have to, then they get that money themselves.
Would it be sort of like a communist thing if like the inflation was happening at the same time as wages, or is that not related at all?
It depends. Like there are some people who would argue that that was communist, but like if you take a look at a program like Social Security right now has along with it something called a COLA, which is a cost of living adjustment, which means every single year when inflation goes up, Social Security payments go up as well. So many individuals in that program like that, but then they also get nervous when something like that would be applied in other places. And that's very good. What's up?
During imperialism, we would annex certain places to get because of tariffs and
Yes.
trading, like Hawaii. So why can't they just not put a tariff on Hawaii? Like just not put a tariff on Hawaii and put a tariff on everything else instead of having to annex it.
When we take a look at the annexation of Hawaii, everything you said was true. And if it was all in an isolated system, then that would be, let me phrase it differently. Hawaii has got a bunch of different things going on with it. So there are some people who want it inside of our tariff wall so we could trade easily with them. There are sugar producers, though, in other places that do not want Hawaii trading their sugar with the United States, and they love having a tariff that blocks off Hawaii. So the way to bring them in is there are other reasons why we went into Hawaii as well, like Alfred Mahan, and the argument that Pearl Harbor is a great naval base. And so these people might really not like the idea of inclusion of Hawaiian sugar in our markets, but they might be pretty cool about us having a cooling station in Hawaii that could then allow us to reach the Philippines, that would then open up China for the open door policy. So there's a lot of trade-offs going on where with imperialism it's military plus tariffs plus raw materials plus spreading religion plus spreading democracy. So it's that five that's leading to these decisions. And sometimes it's creating coalitions of people who don't necessarily see the same reason for doing what we're doing. They all want the same end result though. Is there anything else you would like to explain before we get into your review for today? Nice. So is there anybody who would be willing to be a scorekeeper today? Go ahead. So if you want to be there, you can. Or else if you want to be up here, you can. It's totally up to you.
I prefer sitting.
Okay. So will you announce regularly what our score is?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice.
What are the team names?
Team War. Team Wall.
You get it right.
Wait.
People inside of our tariff walls are able to trade with them. It's spreading democracy. It's spreading religion, Christianity. Yep. You are on Team Door. I'm sorry, you're on Team Wall. You're on Team Wall. I'm struggling. So let's get started. Yes. Now, first of all, I apologize if I'm having any problems today. I tried to grade last night with like an allergy attack, then I went to bed, and my boy woke up at like 3 and climbed into bed with us. And he's 11 years old, and he's like 100+ pounds. And then I got up at like 5 this morning to be here for the review, so I'm struggling. I'm excited to be here with you guys. So if I make mistakes like going, hey, this is Team Door, I'm wow. All right, so here's what's going to be happening is this. We'll play that. You know, this is in your class. So what'll happen is this. You'll slap the desk, raise your hand. I will then finish the clue for anybody who is not quick enough to be able to jump in. And then what we will be doing is this. On your own desk, what I would like you to do, please, is I want you to keep tallies about how many right answers you get. This will be your own personal scoreboard. But then after you get 5 answers, you must take 5 questions off. So once you slap in and get 5 answers right, and I call on you, announce you.
In a row? Or
no, total. You take a 5-question cooldown period just to let other people have a chance to jump in. All right, you got me? All right, so. Are we ready to get started? Sweet. In 1588, this was an attempted invasion of England, and it failed because of an attack by the British fleet and by it is the Spanish Armada. When the Spanish Armada was defeated, that then escalated the English to become the top navy in the world, and that's why we're speaking British and not Spanish. And so let's get started next. In the Americas, our first attempt to colonize was this failed colony off Roanoke, off the coast of North Carolina. All that was left was a tree that had Roanoke carved in the side of it, and then they disappeared. Our next colony that we see for the British is going to be Jamestown. And with Jamestown, we are going to have this man elevated to the point of... That is not correct. So this side is frozen out until this side gets... Listen to the question. Did you want? It is John Smith. John Smith announced that if you do not work, you shall not eat. And so that is 2 points for Team Door, unless you want to become your own personal team. Sweet. Let me see. This man introduced tobacco. It is John Gall. Now, remember, what you need to do is slap your desk and raise your hand so I can see that you're out there. When I scanned the room, I did not see your hand in the air. Was it there? All right. In the Chesapeake, this was the system that was used to grant 50 acres of land to anyone. Headright system is correct. To anyone who brought over a worker, including indentured servants. In 1620, this document was the first official charter created by an individual. It is the Mayflower Compact that was created as the first form of self-government when people came over to America. Now, what was weird is when the Pilgrims arrived here, they discovered that there was a Native American in the area who spoke English. This man taught them how to, it was Squanto, taught them how to use farming practices that would allow them to survive during their initial settlement. From 1629 to 1640, we had this movement that included John Winthrop bringing Puritans.
First Great Awakening.
It is not the First Great Awakening. Bringing
Great Migration.
the Great Puritan Migration is correct. And so for you guys, what I'd like to highlight for you is notice that thread. We have had 3 great migrations. The Puritans back during the time of Massachusetts, and World War I and World War II for African Americans. We're going to find that in Massachusetts, they weren't the most tolerant bunch that was out there. And so this individual claimed that their Indians' land had been stolen by the Massachusetts colony. This person wanted a separation of church and state. And eventually he created this, Roger Williams created Rhode Island as a haven for dissidents. In 1638, this woman practiced Anne Hutchinson is right. Antinomianism, the idea that she could connect with God personally, that led to her being exiled to Rhode Island. She was slaughtered by Indians outside of New York in what was seen as a divine intervention. In 1692, in one of the earliest versions of nativism, new immigrants to this area plus old immigrants clashed in this metaphysical sort of problem where there was claimed that these Halloween-type people were stalking. The Salem witch trials is correct. What's wrong with her saying Salem? I like it. That's good. She's from, where are you from? That's a regional dialect. Don't be mean. In 1662, it was determined that the puritanical religion had rules that were too strict for entrance. This is the halfway covenant, where they determined that there was going to be a new path for young Puritans to be able to enter the church. William Penn established Pennsylvania as a haven for this religion. Quakers is correct. Lord Baltimore established this colony as a haven for Catholics. Maryland. North Carolina and South Carolina were created for the purpose of allowing Barbados slave owners to be able to grow these 2 crops. Molly? Rice and indigo is correct. James Oglethorpe created Georgia as a haven for these individuals. Debtors is correct. 4 people. In 1735, this man faced a trial because he wrote nasty. Singer trial is correct. Nasty things about a local British official, was accused, but an American jury let him off because what he wrote was true, creating an establishment of the idea of our First Amendment. This war in 1637 took place in Connecticut, where English people and their Indian allies wiped out. Powhatan War is not correct. Good guess, but that's in the Chesapeake. Wiped out this Native American. That is not correct. Wiped out this Native American tribe. You can have 5 seconds to discuss with one another for 1 point.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah.
It is the Pequot War.
Yes,
From 1675 to 1676, we had a series of Indian attacks on Puritan towns that inflicted heavy casualties because they had formed an alliance. This alliance fell apart, though, and the Native Americans were then run out of New England in this war that was given a very English-sounding name. It is King Philip's War. I couldn't tell what she was doing because she went, ha! It's given her acting talents. I couldn't tell if she was doing testing a hot stove or if she was answering the question. I mean, you're all right. From 1651 to 1673, while the British were trying to employ mercantilism in the colonies, they imposed these acts inside the Americas to try to. The Navigation Act is correct. In 1754, Benjamin Franklin organized this meeting to try to create a central government in the Americas to protect. What do you mean, no? You slapped it? Yes, I called on you. To create a central government, you may slap it on the side.
The Albany
It
Congress.
is the Albany Congress. That's correct. What did you do? Like, I thought you went.
I was like, you're gonna tell it, and then.
Maybe choose a different thing next time, like, what do you know? And I won't call you that.
I did it.
Oh, that's a bad one. See me. Let's see here. Following the French and Indian War, which was won because William Pitt decided to focus on America rather than on Europe as they had done in previous wars, this is going to be a British victory. But after the war is done, the Proclamation Line of 1763 is going to be created because there's a legitimate threat from the state of America and the alliance.
It starts with a P.
Yes, it does.
The threat came because of this alliance by a Native American whose name starts with a P, who was a threat to colonists on the western frontier. You may slap in. It is Pontiac, is correct. 2 points.
Yeah, that's what I said.
In 1764, a law was passed by the king to try to make up the debts that were owed to is the Sugar Act. Now, this law put a tax on molasses, which could then be used to be making into rum, which is part of the slave trade. This law, though, was not the thing that set colonists off. The Stamp Act did that, making both lawyers and newspapermen really angry, and the Stamp Act Congress got that repealed. But at the same moment the king announced this law, the Declaratory Act is correct, 2 points, which said the colonists must obey every law that's created in the future. Now, as a result, in Boston with Samuel Adams, this organization was created to resist the Sons of Liberty. Is correct. No. So we had the Townsend duties created in 1767. This created a lot of tension inside the colonies, so much so that in 1770 we had this skirmish that was not the start of the revolution, but it was Boston Massacre, a violent occurrence against the Redcoats. Following the Boston Massacre, this organization was created that sent letters back and forth throughout the colonies.
Committees of correspondence.
The committees of correspondence is correct. When the Tea Act took place in 1773, the colonists rebelled against the Boston Tea Party, and as a result, the British decided to create the Intolerable Act, which punished the colonists by shutting down Boston. In 1775, America started the American Revolution accidentally with an outbreak of violence that happened in these two cities, Lexington and Concord.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, what's wrong? Why are you throttling your dog?
You deserved it.
Okay. When did you have your hand up first?
I had my hand up, but I forgot to tap the bell.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I didn't freeze you out accidentally.
You're good.
So, we had a number of battles that took place. Bunker Hill convinced a lot of Americans that we could stand toe-to-toe with the British. We lost New York, unfortunately, but in 1776 we had the turning point of the war with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence guaranteed that we have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that all men are entitled to these things and they're inalienable. These ideas were coming from a philosopher, John Locke, who had been dead for about a century, but his words inspired people in the United States. John Locke is a philosopher who is representative of a new philosophical trend, the Enlightenment, 2 points, where we are now using more scientific rather than religious methodologies to analyze the way the world works. What controversial decision, after invading the North, the British took over all the major cities, But Washington was involved in guerrilla tactics. The North was mostly farmers, and so they decided to invade the South. What controversial tactic did the British use to try to win support in the South from people who might be willing to rebel? You slapped him just to give you that? No, thank you. All right. Go ahead.
They would ask slaves to fight for them if they didn't do it release.
Absolutely. Too.
That's what I was thinking.
Why are you reacting with hostility?
No,
That's how I would give you points.
because like I knew that and I was
I knew
gonna
it
say
too.
that. But
Cool.
it's not like a
Can I give you a piece of advice?
Yeah.
Next time, just try that one else, because I can guarantee this one, never mind, is not going to get you any points. All right, so just that was a bad strategy. That was flawed. The turning point in the American Revolution was this battle against the French. Saratoga is correct. To join against the British in the American Revolution. In 1781, this battle of America and their French allies was able to capture Cornwallis, and Yorktown is correct. So now here's the deal. Once you get 5, you take 5 questions off, and then you repeat the process. So as soon as you get another 5, you take another 5 off. I'm not saying you did anything bad. I'm just FYI. When the Articles of Confederation were created, they are largely recognized for only having one notable positive benefit for the governance of our country. What is it that they did that's seen as positive? The Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance are going to be seen as positives of the Articles of Confederation. Our dilemma, though, is that we're going to have a lot of things going wrong during this time period. We're not repaying the French. We also have the Jay-Gardaki Treaty, where the Mississippi River was shut down by the Spanish. And we have this uprising in 1780. Did you slap him first?
Yeah.
Shays Rebellion is correct. 2 points. All right.
That's so
When the Constitution was brought up to replace the Articles of Confederation, one of the things that needed to be determined was representation for the people. And in the Great Compromise, they determined that we were going to create the Congress in a very unique way. What did the Great Compromise determine? We are going to be a bicameral legislature, and if you could, can you explain to me how each of the 2 houses are going to be decided? How are they going to figure out how many members each state is in the Senate? Go ahead. No, how are they going to figure out how many people are allowed? So let me stop you, please. We're going to give the points to Tina, and let me just say this because I just turned it into a mess and asking it so badly. The Senate is going to have 2 people per state. House is going to have population decided representation, and let's move on. In order to satisfy Southerners, I gotta do that. I'm so sorry, Jay. I'm so stupid. Alright. Me too. And it's gonna hang up since what's that? No, not here. Alright, next question. I'm so sorry, please forgive me.
I just noticed.
I should have. Next question. In the Constitution, they created this accommodation to previous compromise, that's correct. They created this accommodation to give the South more power in the House of Representatives. Let's move past the time period. Another highlight of my teaching career. That's a really special moment right there. For the Constitution, the Federalists were opposed by this group of individuals who demanded the creation of Bill of Rights, and that is the anti-federalism.
Right.
Can I do what? Keep being quiet. What do you say?
He said he wants to see it.
You want to skip 4?
Like
No.
Oh.
Actually, I think
Don't do it.
We're about 1/4 of the way through. So,
What's the score?
what is the score?
Yeah, you said you were outfit. Team Walsh.
Yeah.
Let me do my best. I'm gonna go Team Walsh for
Dora's 45.
Sit back down.
I'm having 45. You guys have 34.
Sorry, you're giving 2 points because people slapped it.
Like, you know, you have to like people laugh.
That's what you said.
Okay. So, we're giving 1 point for any correct answer. So that's the reason why the number, aren't you?
No, every time someone slaps it the first time,
Yeah.
then I give them 2.
Oh, you're awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Alright, so let's keep rolling then, because what Sarah wanted was move faster, and we just slowed down for like 4 minutes. Were you raising your hand? Okay, I gotcha. For Alexander Hamilton, he created a plan where he had funding, assumption, and the creation of a bus in order to pay for the funding and the assumption, though, he needed to raise taxes, and he did so on this product, whiskey, which created a rebellion during Washington's presidency. In the 1790s, we had a revolution that took place in France. A Frenchman came to America and tried to start a rebellion. Here, Citizen Genet is that person. He is a man who came to America, tried to get Americans to build ships, and engage in the French Revolution. The resolution to that was George Washington told him if he didn't stop doing that, he would be deported and his head would be cut off with the guillotine. So he stopped doing that.
Wait, they were deport that Ella's body?
They would send Genet back to France because who he'd been working for had all been executed by this point. And so he was a major. Citizen Genet. Edmund Genet.
Look at the song.
During Washington's presidency, we sent Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay to England. When he came back with Jay's treaty, he was universally reviled, but his treaty confused the Spanish into opening up the Mississippi. Take these treaties correct. Opening up the Mississippi River and giving us a chunk of Florida. During the Adams presidency, what's that? Jack? Okay, Harry?
He already took his break.
Harry's got impeccable morals and character. I don't doubt him one bit. Look at him. He says he does.
Look at that face.
During the Adams presidency, we sent people to France, and they were asked for a bribe, which led to the Okay, if you're going to say XYZ affair, that's not the answer. All right, which led to the XYZ affair. This led to a gigantic quasi-war between France and England. To fight the quasi-war, John Adams created these laws, which made it illegal, Jack.
Sedition and.
I'm sorry, what?
Wait,
Sedition and.
yeah, we got it wrong. We got it. Yeah.
Alien sedition.
Alien Sedition Act is correct.
They got it wrong.
They did?
So, because we answered the wrong one, so we didn't get the right question. That's not fair. We should give us a chance. You guys started before. Just
So here's excuse me, please.
I'm sorry, my hair's trying to get
Things are getting heated in the review during the Adams presidency. So here's the deal. If you slap it wrong, you're just out for that time. I'll offer it to the other side. I should have been more strict with that rule.
But it wasn't. Well, it's 20 people slapped it.
So here's the deal. You jumped the gun. It's not the question you're out.
Yeah.
All right. Sure. response to the Alien and Sedition Act, Jefferson and Madison believed that the farmers were being abused since they were members of the Democratic Republican Party. They released these announcements that said, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, that states have the duty to defend their people against a federal government that's out of control, and they get to nullify federal law. So each time you've seen the idea of states' rights through our history, whether it's the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of people are harkening back to Jefferson and Madison when they're doing that sort of stuff. When Jefferson won the election of 1800, John Adams tried to sabotage him by packing the courts with the midnight judges. During the midnight judge time period, we're going to have John Marshall become our head of the Supreme Court. He is going to determine that he has the power of judicial review. Judicial review in Marbury versus Madison.
There you go. My first one, got it.
In 1819, this Supreme Court decision by John Marshall determined that the federal government had superiority over the states when McCulloch versus Maryland, when the state of Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States location that was in Maryland. We're going to see in 1819 John Marshall stand up for contract law by arguing that the charter that this college made with the King of England, Dartmouth versus Woodward is correct, was something that was a contract. In 1824, this decision determined that the federal government could regulate interstate travel. Gibbons versus Ogden is that court case. In the election of 1800, the Democratic Republicans won for the first time, but they were confused because in the Constitution, the presidential and vice presidential ballots were equal, which meant that this man, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr is the right answer. So Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. She told me the whole life story, and so she gave me the right answer eventually. For Thomas Jefferson, he is going to use the Marines for the first time. When he goes overseas to battle, these individuals, in what is now known as the Barbary Pirates, is known as the Halls of Tripoli, where we're going to have the Marines step in and not. Yes. In 1800, we had Napoleon, who was in control of France, with schemes of taking over the United States. He was, you've lost, you're frozen out now. His attempts to invade the United States were foiled, though, because you had a Haitian revolution led by Toussaint Louverture that prevented the French from invading. Eventually, he then sold the Louisiana Purchase to America, and here's your next question. These individuals were sent across America to figure out what was purchased in Louisiana. Lewis and Clark, you deceived me because you know. In 1807, France and England were having foreign policy issues with one another, and we tried. The Embargo Act is correct. We tried to trade with both. They started impressing our sailors and stealing our ships, and then we decided to cut off all trade. We then had the Non-Intercourse Act. We then had Macon's Bill No. 2, and finally, the War Hawks got fed up and decided to start the War of 1812. The two most famous war hawks were this man from Kentucky and this man from South Carolina, who pushed us into a war to invade Canada. Correct. Good point. The invasion of Canada failed because our militia was not prepared to invade a gigantic landmass. The British, though, had no problem entering into and burning down this major American city. New Orleans is not correct. Washington, D.C. is correct.
They went from Canada to New Orleans and sparked this.
The Federalist Party ended up disintegrating because at the end of the War of 1812, they had the Hartford Convention. They made the announcement that we could not win the war, but with the Treaty of Ghent, we won the war. Also, they claimed that we couldn't defeat the British military, but this man at New Orleans proved that we could. Andrew Jackson was that guy. Following the War of 1812, Henry Clay became very influential and he created his American system. What are the three elements? Correct. That was what created the American system. 2 points. In 1820, we had our first of the many Henry Clay compromises to hold the country together. So you, and you are out. The Missouri Compromise. For those of you that I didn't point at, what are the three elements of the Missouri Compromise? $36.30. Missouri's correct. 2 points. 3630, Missouri is a slave state, Maine is a free state. Following the situation that happened in New Orleans, Andrew Jackson became a hero. He got involved in the Seminole Wars, where he invaded Florida. Spain was angry about this, and they demanded satisfaction from our current Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. But John Quincy Adams' response was, if you want to keep Florida, you should defend it, otherwise you can't control Jackson. As a result, we got Florida in this 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty is correct. This announcement made by John Quincy, it was created by John Quincy Adams, but was delivered by the president at the time. The Monroe Doctrine told Europeans that they should stay out of the Americas. In the election of 1824, we have what's known as the corrupt bargain. And in the corrupt bargain, we had two individuals that were accused of scheming against Andrew Jackson to steal the presidency from him. Who were those two individuals? John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay is correct. 2 points. When Andrew Jackson became president, he is known for a number of different things. Number one is his bank war, where they realized that the bus was going to expire in 1836 at the end of his 20-year charter, right at the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and there'd be nothing they could do to prevent that happening. Henry Clay, though, worked with this head of the Bank of the United States to come up with a scheme to recharter early in the item they could pressure Andrew Jackson into doing so. Instead, this failed magnificently and led to Jackson's re-election over Henry Clay. Who was Henry Clay's accomplice as the head of the Bank of the United States who came up with this scheme? It is Nicholas Biddle is correct. What? To kill the Bank of the United States, Andrew Jackson took all the money out of the bus and put it into these institutions. The pet banks is correct. And then they over-speculated on land and led to the Panic of 1837, especially because Andrew Jackson made this announcement. He said, I love... What's that? Correct. The specie circular is correct. He announced to everybody, I only want gold money to buy land. So everybody rushed in, cashed in their paper money, took out all the gold, and crashed every bank in the United States. Panic of 1837. For Andrew Jackson, he has also going to encounter a crisis that takes place because the nullification crisis is correct. South Carolina was angry about a protective tariff created in 1828. In 1830, this man was famous for having a debate with a South Carolinian named Robert Hayne. It is Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster argued that you are not allowed to nullify because you must have union, now and forever, one and inseparable, which is another thing you would echo during the Compromise of 1850. Let's see here. In 1811, William Henry Harrison gained notoriety because he was able to attack and defeat this Native American leader. It wasn't the Battle of Tippecanoe, but who is the Native American leader? No answer. Tecumseh is correct, which leads to the curse of Tecumseh that we have for presidents going from that point forward. Also, regarding Native Americans, this court case was heard by John Marshall, which was argued by the Cherokee Nation that they should not be... Perfect. Worcester versus Georgia or Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, where John Marshall argued no, the Cherokee should not be forced to move because they've got a contract as a treaty with the state of Georgia and the United States government, and Jackson's response is, they've made their decision, now let's see them enforce it. They have no military, and so this starts the Trail of Tears. We're going to have Andrew Jackson replaced then, after his presidency, with our next big president, but he is only around for a limited amount of time. William Henry Harrison, when he passes away, will be replaced by what then was our first vice president that moved in the presidency. John Tyler is that guy. Your problem during this time period, though, is we have one established party, the Jacksonian Democrats, and then the Whigs are made up by people who hate Andrew Jackson. There's also another party that emerges during this time period that is fearful of secret societies. The Anti-Masonic League emerges, especially with their trouble by Jackson and Henry Clay both being Freemasons. During John Tyler's presidency, we have an uprising that takes place along our southern boundary because this area has a revolution. Texas has their revolution, and they gain their independence. For Americans, though, they're very nervous about absorbing Texas because this can become 1, 2, 3, or 4 slave states. And so we're going to find that throughout the Tyler presidency, we're battling over whether or not we should absorb Texas. And then this is our course. James K. Polk is going to be the guy who annexes Texas. And with James K. Polk, he believes in a new philosophy that we should move from East Coast to West Coast across the Manifest Destiny is going to be the name of that policy that we're going to move across the country quickly. Now, when we get into a battle over Oregon, in the Oregon Territory, we have a famous slogan that 54-40 or fight, we only are going to be willing to, we don't want to fight for that because that's like northern Canada. So instead, we just want Puget Sound. On the other hand, this famous future president, who was a Whig at this time, demanded from James K. Polk to see the bloody Abraham Lincoln bloody spot along the southern border because he believed that we sparked a war with Mexico by crossing the Nueces River towards the Rio Grande to start that war up. In the war that took place, the Mexican-American War, this man was the first military hero in northern Mexico, and eventually is not Sam Houston, and eventually became president because of this. Zachary Taylor is that guy, old, rough, and ready. He is fired by Polk because of the fact that he is becoming so popular. This second general will gain notoriety for conquering the middle part of Mexico, and he will eventually create the Anaconda Plan after he runs for president later on. It is not Ulysses S. Grant, good guess. It is Winfield Scott. Never will show up on the AP test, but it's nice to know. I mean, that's out of nowhere. During this time period, many Americans start philosophically thinking about how they can move beyond their physical form and appreciate truths in the universe. You got transcendentalism that is emerging during this time period. You also have a new religious faith. Joseph Smith in upstate New York the Mormon faith will emerge during this time period. We also have utopians that are emerging during this time. Like there are some who believe that sexuality is simple. What's that? It's not the United for this society, and if they think it's sinful, they're doing a lot of it. And so, but this is for your side of the room. These individuals believe that sexuality is sinful because childbirth is so painful. So they believe in abstinence, modeled after their Mother Ann Lee. So what is this religious group? What is the name of this group? Do you have an answer? No answer. They are the Shakers, absolutely.
Oh my God! Is that one point?
They are people who believe that sexuality is immoral because childbirth is so painful, so they believe in abstinence. That is my clue. This woman decided during the Second Great Awakening to start focusing on prison and mental institution. Dorothea Dix is correct. This man believed that your diet would determine how healthy you were, and so he encouraged you to eat really delicious crackers that are good with chocolate and marshmallow in the form of some s'mores. It was Graham, Sylvester Graham, believed if you eat graham crackers, you would stay healthy. Yes. Sylvester Graham. Who said, who the hell is that?
I did.
It's Sylvester Grant.
I
All right. In 1817, an anti-slavery movement was created with the idea that they were going to take African slaves and send them to Liberia. American Colonization Society is correct. In 1831, we had a gigantic slave uprising in Virginia that freaked out. Nat Turner is correct. A lot of slave owners. In that same year, in what led to conspiracy theories, this man created his book, his magazine called The Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison is correct. William Lloyd Garrison's inspiration eventually created this new group of people who were against slavery. That is not correct. What's the name of their society? What's that? It is not the Free Soilers. You have 5 seconds to group. What's the name of the group that they created to replace the American Colonization Society? Do you have an answer? What? No answer? Over here. American Anti-Slavery Society is correct. In 1844, this was instituted in Congress to prevent abolitionists from causing problems by bringing up laws. It is the gag rule. In 1840, this political party was created, which was strictly focused on abolitionism in the United States. Liberty Party is correct. In 1862, this law was created, giving away free land on the western frontier to anybody who wanted to farm. Homestead Act is correct, 160 acres. In 1834, this invention, the predecessor to the modern combine, allowed the McCormick Reaper is correct. In 1837, this man created a steel plow to replace wood plows to allow you to cut through. That is not correct. To cut through the western frontier's grasslands. Who is this man whose steel plow was created? It is John Deere is correct.
Mr. Homestead, to echo the previous compromise, you should get more points than less people.
Because we really want to look at the three-fifths compromise as a good example of what we should be doing in our daily lives. No, that would be bad. In the 1854 presidential election, we had a new political party emerge that was nativistic in form and what? It's the No Nelly Party. This woman, during the time of the Civil War and immediately before that, was known as Moses because of her ability to navigate the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman is correct. In 1837, this man announced that slavery was not a necessary evil, it was a positive good for our country. John C. Calhoun is correct. In 1830, this man released his Appeal to the American Negro, in which he asked the question, what do you have to lose from rebelling because everything's bad? It is David Walker who engages in that. He dies shortly afterwards. This man, during the time period of the American Civil War, was both a great abolitionist and also a woman's rights person. He created the North Star. It is not William Lloyd Garrison. The North Star newspaper spread his vision, and he was somebody who worked closely with William Lloyd Garrison. Mark Twain is not correct. That's
Frederick Douglass.
It is Frederick Douglass is correct. In the 1840s and 1850s, there were different schemes to take over areas in the South that might lead to new territories for slavery. Like during Franklin Pierce's presidency, he created the Austin Manifesto with the idea that we might be able to annex what country? Cuba is correct. We also had a group of individuals called filibusters who were interested in taking over other parts of the world. And this man was somebody who was actually able to successfully conquer Nicaragua, make himself the leader, but before he was able to get the country annexed, he had a counter-revolution that was executed. It was this filibuster who tried to expand slavery on his own. That guy's name is William Walker.
Oh,
I know names on this. All these guys' names on this.
They do.
Yeah.
So let's give you something that sounds different. In 1848, at the end of the Mexican-American War, this treaty was created, which gave the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Best treaty ever. In 1854, Stephen Douglas wanted to create a transcontinental railroad out to California, and in return, he had to create this compromise.
Popular sovereignty, right?
Can you give me more details? Because it doesn't.
Letting the people decide if they feel
What was the compromise that included popular sovereignty?
It is Nebraska!
Yes! In 1852, this novel created by Harriet Beecher Stowe inflamed Northerners. Uncle Tom's Cabin is correct. In 1857, this book, written by a Southerner, argued that there should be a movement towards industrialization. That is not correct. Go ahead. It's really close to that. So I'm going to give it to you. The Impending Crisis in the South by Hidden Our Helper. If you wrote The Impending Doom, most people would see that as a minor error and not be too troubled by that. In 1856, this Supreme Court case determined that slaves were property and could be taken to any Dred Scott decision is correct. During the Civil War, this was the bloodiest day of the Civil War in 1862, and it led to Antietam, which led to the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of that year. In 1863, this was the bloodiest battle of the war, and served as a turning point for the rest of the war after Grant and Sherman were turned loose on the South. The beginning process for the war, the strategy for the North, was called this strategy. The Anaconda Plan is correct. Meanwhile, the South during the Civil War had this strategy in which they would try to use their agriculture to leverage. The King Cotton strategy is correct. During the Civil War, Lincoln created this plan for Reconstruction, which would allow the South to come back easily. 10% plan. Meanwhile, radical Republicans had this idea to really punish the South harshly, but this law was pocket vetoed by Lincoln and not allowed to go into law. What was the name of this bill that was killed in 1864? It's the Wade Davis bill. During Reconstruction, the North decided to try to figure out ways to force the South to change with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. But economically, the South was able to stop the advancement of African Americans by largely pressing them to sharecropping. This scandal took place during the Grant presidency, in which a secret credible leader is correct. In which a fake company was created to double bill the government, and the government was willing to look the other way because they were part owners of the company. These individuals were Republicans who moved from the North to the South to become elected officials. Carpetbaggers is correct. Are you slapping when you're doing these gang signs?
No, I'm like, I'm scared. I'm like, ooh, do I like know it? And then I get close to slapping it, but I'm always like.
So I haven't missed you, right? Like, you haven't slapped it once and then be like just tunnel vision without seeing peripheral vision, right? Okay, good. I just want to make sure I wasn't freezing you out. The Compromise of 1876 led to the end of Reconstruction when this man became the president. Hayes is correct. We are now done with half your stuff. We are now moving past the Civil War. In 1896, the Supreme Court case determined that there could be segregation as long as it was done with equal. Plessy versus Ferguson is correct. What did I do? Did I do something wrong? Okay. All right. This woman in the late 1800s tried to document lynching so that she could then portray. Ida B. Wells is correct. This civil rights leader announced to the Atlanta Exposition of Southern white business owners that they should hire black people. It is not Du Bois. It is Booker T. Washington, absolutely. And then W.E.B. Du Bois created his Talented 10th program. He also, in the early 1900s, created this organization, NAACP, that tried to pursue legal justice through the court system by documenting segregation. This man was, and it's weird that this guy's in a history book, but it gives hope to history teachers like me. This guy was a University of Wisconsin professor who wrote the frontier thesis that the West was what gave America its characteristics. Frederick Jackson Turner is correct. This Native American conflict happened in 1862 here in the state of Minnesota, and once it was resolved, Lincoln had to reduce the number of people who were being executed as a result of this conflict. What was that war called? Never mind. Well, that's going to come back to bite me, isn't it? All right. Were you just cheering that she said never mind? Do you have an answer? Anybody want to slap in? Okay. That is the Dakota conflict. Dakota conflict. In 1876, we have this gigantic turning point battle where the Native Americans win, and the Lakota are going to be victorious. Little Bighorn is correct, but then there's going to be a massive retaliation coming from the government. This Native American group in the northwestern part of the United States is going to be forced to flee for their lives. The Nez Perce is going to be correct, absolutely. And then finally, this massacre in 1890 signaled the end of the Indian Wars. Wounded Knee is correct. In the late 1800s, we're going to have initially the reservation system, but that's going to be replaced by this, the Dawes Severalty Act, which is going to carve up their land into independent homesteads instead. This man is somebody who is going to create the idea of a modern business college with his ideas of scientific management, which is going to try to figure out how to create maximum. Jack? Are you saying Frederick Turner? Frederick Turner is not correct, although we just discussed Frederick Turner with his Turner thesis. So do you have an answer for what the name of this guy is who spells the idea of scientific management? You need to slap an answer to me, not talk to them. Time's up. Answer as a group. Frederick Taylor is correct. Also known as Taylorism, this is the new philosophy of utmost efficiency inside the factories. In the late 1800s, this man is going to use the Bessemer process to create a massive fortune in steel. You just went like this. You're like, go ahead. It is not Rockefeller. The answer is a group. Carnegie is that person. John D. Rockefeller is going to create a monopoly, but then once monopoly legislation starts attacking them, he is going to shift to this new business structure where he is going to start creating trusts instead. In the late 1800s, he's not the richest man initially in the monopolies, but this guy who owns monopolies in banking or mechanics, J.P. Morgan, is going to start buying up all sorts of other businesses, so he becomes involved in a lot of monopolies. He's also the guy who starts creating interlocking directorates, where he wants to create efficiency by getting rid of competition in the late 1800s when he owned steel and railroads and other sorts of things. In the late 1800s, this is Andrew Carnegie's philosophy for how he believes that philanthropy, gospel of wealth, is correct, building libraries and universities to try to help elevate people out of their problems. In 1869, this union of skilled and unskilled workers was created, but this is the Knights of Labor. They eventually ended with the Haymarket Riot. In 1881, this union will take only skilled workers. It's still, AFL is correct, it's still around nowadays. This union created in 1905 was incredibly radical, was openly socialistic, threatened violence inside the factories, and their one-eyed leader, Big Bill Haywood, was deported during the Red Scares because they were seen as so radical. It is the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. In 1877, we have a gigantic strike during the Panic of 1873 that affects all parts of the United States. What industry would have
Railroads.
Railroads is correct. In 1894, we had the railroads go on strike yet again. Grover Cleveland shut down the strike by attaching a mail car to every train that was in the stockyards. This rail strike was about a specific type of rail car where the workers, the Pullman Palace car strike, which took place then. In the late 1800s, this man became the symbol for corrupt political machines when his leadership of Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, exposed the corruption that was taking place there. During the period of imperialism, William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer were both publishing inflammatory stories that dragged us into the war. That was yellow journalism. As a result of Garfield's shooting, he's going to be replaced by Chester A. Arthur, who came from political machines, but he created the Pendleton Act. This law ended the spoil system in some ways in the United States by creating a test. This man was elected as a replacement for the corrupt Republicans because the stalwart state Republican, but once half-breeds voted for this guy, who was seen as a fixer of corruption. Grover Cleveland is correct. During Grover Cleveland's presidency, we had court cases like Mugg versus Illinois and the Wabash cases where the Supreme Court said initially states could regulate railroads, then they said they couldn't, and as a result they created this institution in the government to regulate trade that was happening in a large nationwide state. It is the Interstate Commerce Commission that's created during this time. During Benjamin Harrison's presidency, he presides over the $1 billion Congress. He is famous for giving away lots of our extra money that we got from tariffs, especially to these individuals who are given pensions. Civil War veterans get gigantic pensions during that time. In the late 1800s, William McKinley went up against William Jennings Bryan, who merged the Democratic Party with this new farmer movement that was hoping the populist movement is correct. For William McKinley, the economic crisis, the Panic of 1893, and the inflation that the farmers wanted was created in this accidental way when we discovered gold in what area? Alaska is correct. This religious movement for reform in the late 1800s asked, what would Jesus do if he was here right now? And social gospel was correct. They created the Salvation Army as a response to that. This incident in Texas helped to create local reform by bringing the idea of city managers. Galveston hurricane is correct. Robert La Follette was the famous governor of this state that created the Wisconsin Plan that was the statewide level of populism. In 1873, this organization was created that was anti-alcohol and trying to figure out ways to create. Can you be more specific with the group? you is correct.
Give yourself two. Have that. The Anti-Saloon League was the more radical group, and they had working for them this woman who would travel through Carrie Nation, travel through the West with her hatchets, smashing up saloons. It is your point. Cool beans. During the early 1900s, this organization was, which had already been formed in the 1890s, was being led by Carrie Chapman Catt, who was trying to figure out ways to give women the right to vote. What was the name of that organization? Not correct. That's the 1960s, 70s. Good guess, though. That's not correct. You have 5 seconds to discuss as a group. Do you have an answer? That is not correct. Do you have an answer? You are so close. This is the National American Women's Suffrage Association. When William McKinley was assassinated, Teddy Roosevelt became president, and in his way, he wanted to attack bad trusts. So the way that he did that was by attacking this company that merged. That is not correct. That merged railroads together. James J. Hill from Minnesota and J.P. Morgan had a huge monopoly called this, which was the company that was broken by Teddy Roosevelt. Not correct. You may answer as a group. Do you have an answer? That is not correct. You answer as a group. Do you have an answer?
Northern Railroad.
The Northern Securities Company is what the answer is.
Yeah,
Northern will get that point. They get 1 point over there. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt changed the Interstate Commerce Act to make it stronger. What law allowed him to do that? Not correct. That's during Wilson. Do you have an answer? That is not correct. That's from the late 1800s. Do you have an answer as a group? Take 5 seconds. What law strengthened the Interstate Commerce Act? No answer. Not correct. It is the Elkins Act. I like that one though. In 1908, this Supreme Court decision determined that you could create different working conditions for women to make them less rigorous because they are responsible for pregnancies. What's that? Muller versus Oregon, that's correct. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act was created because of the inspiration in this law-making. That's correct. In the Panic of 1907, for the second time, this man gave a personal loan.
J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan is correct. Teddy Roosevelt decided to create the national park system and expand during this time period because he believed in this sort of environmental conservationism, which is different than preservationism. In 1909, this tariff was created, which was controversial because for Taft, it lowered the tariff somewhat, but not nearly enough to keep Teddy Roosevelt's people happy. What was the name of the tariff? Incorrect. Keep saying that. It's gonna hit sometime. Yes, this tariff was created by Taft. It did not satisfy people who were progressive because it didn't lower tariffs nearly enough.
It's not my turn.
No answer. You may answer as a group.
No! YOLO!
Yo necesito ayudar.
Do you have an answer? It is not the Taft-Hartley Act. This is the Payne-Aldrich tariff. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt ran as a member of this party. Bull Moose or Progressive Party is correct.
This ushered in the Woodrow Wilson presidency. He significantly lowered tariffs during his presidency with this tariff. It is not correct. Keep saying that though, it's going to pay off. Does anyone want to slap it over here? What tariff significantly lowered tariffs during the Wilson presidency? Underwood tariff is correct.
Let's go!
In 1914, Woodrow Wilson created this antitrust law to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act. Clayton Antitrust Act is correct. In 1913, the Glass-Owen Act is created, but it's better known as this institution, which created a backstop for banks so that they would have somebody to lend to them. Federal Reserve is correct. This amendment was created before the Spanish-American War, which announced to the Cubans we had no interest in taking over the country and making them an acquisition of our country. Teller Amendment is correct. What's that? Sure. This amendment was created immediately. Did you slap in? This amendment was created immediately after the Spanish-American War, which announced we did want to influence Cuban policy. This law was created in 1900, which said that we were going to make Puerto Rico a territory of the United States. Yep. This is the 4-Acre Act that takes place. In 1904, this is the announcement that said we were strengthening the Monroe Doctrine with using gunboat diplomacy. The Roosevelt Corollary is correct.
You on that team now?
He is. He just jumped ship. In Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he invaded this country for fear that they were an immoral dictatorship due to a coup that had taken place during the Wilson time period. He even invaded Veracruz in this country to try to stop the shipment of German weapons to this country. It is not Nicaragua. It is not the Philippines. It is Mexico. For Woodrow Wilson, he decided not to get involved in World War I, even after the sinking of the Lusitania, because of this announcement the Germans made that they would no longer attack. The Sussex Pledge is correct. The Sussex Pledge was thrown out the window, though, because the British were able to intercept this message sent to Mexico. The Zimmermann Note is correct. When America entered into World War I, they created this organization to create propaganda to try to stir up public interest to support the war effort. This organization was also known as the Creel Committee. What was the name of this group that Wilson created? This is the CPI, or the Committee for Public Information. This organization in 1917 was created to organize all of the production and shipping. Good guess, it's World War II. This organization was going to be created to do the same thing that they did during World War II, to organize all the shipments and all the War Industries Board is correct. Woodrow Wilson is going to create these two laws that are similar to the laws that Adams created. The Espionage and Sedition Acts is going to be correct. When Wilson entered World War I, he said we were going to make the world safe for democracy because he came in with these ideas, the 14 points to end future wars. Unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, the Treaty of Versailles is going to mess that up, and so the only element of the 14 points that we get in the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. When the League of Nations comes back home, which Republican is able to end the League of Nations with his reservations about the League of Nations? Would you like to reorganize that? Henry Cabot Lodge. So we're going to give one point for the scramble that you just threw out there. That was like a super. In the period right after World War I, we had an incident take place where a bomber was sending bombs all over the place, and this Attorney General decided to engage in a series of raids. Palmer is correct. The Palmer raids that are going to track people down, and this is going to be an element of the Red Scare. We're also going to find that there's a period of nativism that we're going to see during this time period of anti-immigrant feeling, especially because of this controversial court case. Sacco versus Vanzetti is going to be correct. We're also going to find that after World War I, following the Great Migration, this time period is going to be created of racial tension and animosity. The Red Summer of Hate is correct. When Warren G. Harding becomes president, he is going to be somebody who brings in supplies. He does have that, but that's not where the question's going, so you won't be able to slap in at this point. He creates this idea of a return to normalcy with supply-side economics, but his presidency is most noticed for the scandals, especially this one, Teapot Dome, where he has got somebody in his cabinet illegally selling oil to people outside of the government. For Calvin Coolidge, he is going to engage in supply-side economics, especially because of the ideas of his Secretary of the Treasury, who is this famous billionaire who nowadays gives away money. Andrew Mellon is correct. Carnegie Mellon is going to be the institute that gives away money nowadays. We're going to find that during Coolidge's presidency, we are going to have economic good times until the economic crash that takes place during the Hoover presidency. So let me scan forward to that. During the 1920s, though, we are going to have a backlash against immigration. What were the laws called that limited the number of immigrants? The Emergency Quota Act is one, and the National Origins Act is the other. Good job. We're also going to have an issue where we're going to have a battle between science and fundamental Christianity over this court case. The Scopes trial is correct. We're also going to see a return of a more conservative viewpoint when fundamentalist Christians are able to get this amendment put into place to end the consumption of alcohol. The 18th Amendment is correct. We're going to try to prevent future wars when we have what's known as the Powers Treaties, but technically it is not the Kellogg Grand Pact. This set of treaties is going to limit the size of our navies along with the British and Japanese navies. What was the name of this meeting that created this law? It is the Powers Act, but we're looking for the name of the conference. It is the Naval. Would you like to expand on that further? You have one last chance. No. This side of the room may slap in. This is the Washington Naval Conference. In 1924, we cooked up a scheme where we're going to send money from American banks to German government to. Dawes plan is correct. In 1928, we're going to make war illegal with this announcement. What's that? Calabrian is going to be correct. In the Great Depression of 1929, Herbert Hoover is going to come up with the idea that he should increase tariffs at that time to protect American businesses. What is the name of that tariff? Smoot-Hawley tariff is correct.
Oh my God!
Let's go. Yes. In 1932, after Herbert Hoover's presidency, there's going to be a law created that's going to separate banks into risky investment banks, and Glass-Steagall is correct. In 1932, this group of World War I veterans is going to protest marching. The Bonus Army is correct, marching to ask for their pensions early. For Franklin Roosevelt, he is going to create this organization to regulate the stock market in 1934. The SEC is correct. This organization, created in 1933, encouraged farmers to stop growing food to try to elevate the price of food. The AAA is correct. In 1933, this organization created both relief, recovery, and reform by creating gigantic dams along a river system in the southern part of the United States. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The National Labor Relations Act was known as this law, which gave more power to unions to be able to organize and to go on strike. What was the name of this law? Named after its sponsor. That's the Wagner Act. Very good.
All credits to Hannah.
This man had a share our wealth plan where he wanted to tax rich people, you belong, and give everybody a car, a house, and a radio. In 1938, this organization was created to try to keep track of communists that were inside the country during the New Deal. Eventually, they became anti-communist watchdogs hunting down communists in Hollywood during the 40s and 50s, and HUAC is correct. In 1934, Gerald Nye started creating these laws that prevented our ability to sell or transport or loan to countries that are at war. Those are our neutrality acts, absolutely. Now, after the fall of Poland and during the invasion of France, Roosevelt's able to tweak that, where we're going to change that so that that is not correct, where we're going to be able to sell cash and carry is going to be correct. Roosevelt is also going to create this arrangement where we're going to make a trade of weapons for certain strategic locations. What do we trade to the British? Destroyers to get military bases, absolutely. When England gets attacked by the Germans, we switch cash and carry to something even more friendly. Lend-lease is going to be correct. During World War II, in 1942, we're going to create this organization which will control the supplies and the production inside the United States to make sure it's done efficiently. The War Productions Board is going to be correct. We are also going to create this organization that's going to set rationing, and it's going to give people set limits on wages and prices. What's the name of this group? This is the Office of Price Administration that's going to be happening during this time. Let's see here. This court case affirmed that the United States could create internment camps during Korematsu versus the United States is going to be correct. During World War II, we're going to have a number of meetings between the Americans and the Russians and the British. This meeting in February of 1945 was the last meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin that is not correct to discuss the division of post-war Europe. That is not correct. Yalta is correct. Yalta is correct. Following World War II, in the long telegram, George Kennan advised Truman to engage in this policy. Containment is correct. In order to economically help Europe not become communist, this plan was created, the Marshall Plan, by the head of the military during World War II. This organization was an alliance system to try to protect European countries. NATO is correct, so if one was attacked, all were attacked. This was the companion communist plan. Would you like to clarify? The War Powers Act is not correct. The Warsaw Pact is correct. War Powers Act is coming later. This was Harry Truman's idea to continue the New Deal, but it gained very little support from Republicans and Southern Democrats. The Fair Deal is correct. In 1947, this law was created which weakened unions and was passed over Truman's veto. What was the name of this law that weakened unions post-World War II? That's your Taft-Hartley Act. In the election of 1948, this group popped up that eventually ran against the Democrats, led by Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond. This man started attacking communists around the same time as the HUAC, and he was in the State Department. McCarthy is correct of being filled with communists. This man in the 1950s wrote a book on child raising, in which he said that we should focus on the good of the child and not punishing so much. This is Benjamin Spock. In 1954, this Supreme Court case is going to be the thing that ends segregation. Brown versus TV Board of Education. In 1957, this is going to be the place where Eisenhower will need to use the military to forcefully desegregate. Little Rock is correct. In 1956, this construction project became the largest construction project ever in U.S. history. The Interstate Highway Act is correct. In 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine was articulated. What did it say?
It's like it protects all of any friendly enemies from country from the flood.
Correct. This incident in 1960 was controversial because this spy plane was shot down over Russia while Eisenhower was trying to negotiate for peace. That was the U-2 incident. That is correct. In JFK's presidency, he was largely known for foreign policy things like this failed invasion of Cuba. Bay of Pigs. He is also known for this successful intervention in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He also spoke to stop the building of this structure. The Berlin Wall is correct. In the election of 1964, Lyndon Johnson claimed that this guy was somebody who, in your guts, you knew he was nuts. Barry Goldwater is correct. And after his election, Lyndon Johnson declared war on what? Poverty, creating these big sets of government programs, like this program that gave health insurance to old people, and this program that gave health insurance to poor people. I'm not really worried because it's 4:02 and so I'm rushing through the lightning round. And this program that gave preschool to kids who couldn't afford it.
Hands up.
Absolutely.
Hands up.
For LBJ, though, he is going to struggle because he has to make some politically unpopular decisions. Like, in 1964, he passes this law that gives equal rights to people. Correct. And in 65, he passes this rights. Correct, because of what happens in Selma, but he has to steal money from these programs to fight what war? And the exaggeration that he does to get us into the war is the exaggeration of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He is eventually going to be forced out of the presidency because of these horrible attacks in South Vietnam. That makes it look like he's not winning the war in Vietnam. Your Tet offensive, absolutely. Who gets elected for the argument that he's got a plan? Nixon does, but his plan to end the war is called what? Vietnamization. While he simultaneously invaded this neighboring country. Cambodia is correct. Now Nixon is weird because when it comes to environmentalism, he creates what organization? EPA. Food Quality Act. I think we're good getting through the 70s. You guys have any questions for Julius? I'm so proud of you guys for all the hard work you guys have done. So if you guys stick around, it's pretty ambitious.
Score?
Sure.
I really can't count that.
Okay.
10 by 5.
So did you break down how much Harry got? So how about Team Harry versus Team Door versus Team Wall?
I mean, yeah, 20.
I think I
Reaganomics was the idea that the liberal ideas
Sophia did better than 38.
Sophia was killing it. We shrink the size of the government programs and cut taxes and deregulate, and that will help the economy. So it's very much like supply side economics of foolishness. Do you have any other questions, problems I can help out with? What's that?
Student X.
Who's he? I don't know who you're talking about. It's just a nonsense. Did you really?
Well, I looked at the essay beforehand. It said that you got a.
I did not confirm or deny. It's Student X.
Yes, Student X! When you walk in,
If you need any other help, let me know. We got one day left together, so we can chat about any of the good work today, you guys.
It's 283 to 145.
And victory for knowledge and scholarship. Yay, everyone.
I slapped it like hard. I'm not like holding anything back.
It'll recover. It'll recover.
Yeah, better.
I'm set for going right now. You guys are in good shape.